There's so many recipes for bolognese sauce on the internet that say they're authentic, but what is it about this ancient Italian concoction that makes it so authentic? It's definitely not the same as the typical meat sauce most North Americans are familiar with. Rather, a real bolognese is much more a meat and milk sauce than it is a tomato sauce. And in this video, I'm going to attempt to make it as originally as possible. And if you come from the birthplace of bolognese sauce and you're watching this, please let me know in the comments if I get anything wrong. And right off the bat, I know I'm going to lose points here because while I should be starting with pancetta, here I have prosciutto, 60 grams of it. I went to 3 grocery stores today and neither of them had pancetta. But that's okay because a lot of the ancient recipes actually said prosciutto is okay. After all, they're both cured meats and they both come from the same animal. Into some hot olive oil, I'm going to saute this for about a minute until it's barely crispy. Meanwhile, we're going to prepare our sofrito, which is a fancy term for onions, carrots, and celery. And if you've ever been a culinary student at all, you probably know this as a mirepoix. However, we're only going to start by adding in our onions first, because apparently dumping all 3 of them in can mess up the process. So let that saute for about 30 seconds to 1 minute. And how big you chop these vegetables depends greatly on how long you plan to simmer your bolognese. A good bolognese requires at least 3 hours of simmering. So if you're going for the minimum, then cut them pretty small. But if you have time on your hands and you're going for 4 or 5 hours, you can make them a little bigger. Today I plan to simmer this for about 4 hours. Once you add your carrots and celery, season it with a little salt and let it sweat off for about a minute or so until they become fragrant. You don't want it to brown at all, you just want it to be kind of translucent. Whoops. Next, it's time to add in our meat, and here I have 1 pound of ground beef and 1 pound of ground pork. Now you can use a mixture of beef and veal or beef and lamb. One thing I learned in my research is you rarely ever use just beef. You always want to mix it with some other meat. Now, not only do we want to cook this meat until it's brown, but you see all this liquid building in the bottom of the pot here? We have to cook it until all of that evaporates. So if you have a wider pot than the one I'm using, please by all means use it because it's going to go a little faster for you. This ended up taking close to 30 minutes and I got very bored. And you might need to grab a snack. Hopefully it's a healthy one. Once all that meat juice is cooked off and the bottom of the pot looks nice and dry like this, now it's time to add some wine. And most of the authentic recipes called for white wine, though you can use red too. And this we're also going to cook off until it's nice and dry. But don't worry, it's not going to take nearly as long as that meat juice took to cook off, about 5 minutes or so. Once that wine is nice and cooked off, now we're going to add in our tomato paste, 2 tablespoons of it. And tomato paste is an ingredient that appeared in every single recipe for bolognese I came across. And it's usually paired with some other tomato product, whether that's passata or in my case, just some home canned tomatoes I did last year. By the way, if you want to learn how to can your own tomatoes, I've linked that video in the description. Now I'm not going to use very much of this, maybe about 3/4 of a cup or so, and I'm just going to crush them right on the cutting board. Remember, real bolognese does not have a lot of tomato in it, so don't add too much. I'm going to cook this for about 5 minutes because that will intensify the flavor and color of those tomatoes. And now it's time to add in some water. And how much you add also depends on how long you plan to cook this. A good starting point is 2 cups, but because I plan to simmer this for about 4 hours today, I'm going to add in 1 extra cup. A lot of bolognese recipes call for stock, but there's no need to use it because really we're going to be cooking this for so long we're basically making our own stock. After about an hour of simmering with the lid on, this is what it looked like. It's not too much different other than maybe a little more intense in color, and I can feel that the meat is breaking down a little bit. You could eat this now if you wanted to and it'd be delicious, but I promise you it won't be nearly as good as if you let it cook for another couple hours. So we're gonna do that. In the meantime, let's make some pasta. I'm gonna make enough for 2, so basically it's 3/4 to 1 cup of flour to 1 egg per person. And in true pasta granny style, I'm dumping my flour onto my board and doing this the old-fashioned way. But you don't have to do this. In fact, if it's a hot July day and you have no air conditioning like in my case, I recommend you do not. Unless you're weird like me and your bolognese curiosities just can't wait until the cold weather. But anyway, you want to bring this together into a kneadable dough, and you're very likely going to need 2 or 3 tablespoons of water. I don't normally add salt to the dough because I always heavily salt the water when I cook it, and I know a lot of pasta purists out there might disagree with me on that one, but c'est la vie. I wish I knew how to say c'est la vie in Italian, because I totally would have. I'm just going to add a tiny little spoonful more of water, and hopefully this will totally come together. And once it does, you want to knead it for at least 10 minutes. Don't skimp on the kneading, it's really important to develop that gluten, and you want the dough to start looking very smooth and vein-free. This is a sure sign that your pasta is going to have that really nice snap to it. So once it looks really smooth like this, now you can wrap it up in some plastic, and now it's really important to let this rest for 30 minutes. Fresh pasta will keep up to about 1 day like this in your fridge. After that, it starts to change color. Alright, now let's go check on our sauce. This has been cooking for 1 hour and 45 minutes. You can tell the meat is really starting to break down, and it's even starting to feel a little thicker. It is still pretty runny, so I think at this point I'm going to let it continue to cook without the lid. After another hour, this is what it's going to look like. So a total of 2 hours and 45 minutes cooking. So much of the collagen has broken down from the meat and it feels really tender. At this point, I'm going to add some whole milk, 1 cup. You can also use 10% cream if you want a little more decadence. And you want to add it in slowly so this never stops boiling. So it's a good idea to either have your milk at room temperature or even heat it up a little bit before adding it in. Alright, now I'm going to bring this back to a boil and then down to simmer again and let it cook for maybe another 45 minutes to an hour. It really depends how thick you want your sauce to be in the end, but in the meantime, let's roll out our noodles. This dough's been resting for over 30 minutes and it feels really slack. If you wanted to crack out your pasta roller at this point, you can, but we're not going to use one today. I'm just going to sprinkle a little flour on the surface, and pasta dough is always easier to work with in small batches, so I'm going to cut it in half. Now I'm just going to take a regular old rolling pin and roll this out until it's about the size of the cutting board, which happens to be 12 by 18 inches. But before you go writing that down, there's no need to be super precise about this. Just roll it as thin or thick as you want your noodles to be. You'll know when to stop. It is good to know, however, that it's possible to roll your noodles too thin, so you don't want to get too carried away with your rolling. And if at any point your dough becomes difficult to roll, like it's not stretching out, it just needs time to relax more. So just cover it and let it rest for a few more minutes and then try again. I'm just going to keep turning it at 90-degree angles and rolling it out thinner and thinner until I get closer to the size of the cutting board. Once you see how easy it is to make noodles like this, you're probably going to do it more often. And if you don't have a pasta roller right now and you were thinking of investing in one, you might change your mind after seeing this. Just sprinkle a little flour over the surface and roll this up as if you were making a jelly roll. Hopefully your dough isn't sticky at all, but if it is, just use a little more flour. And now just with a regular old kitchen knife, you can start cutting whatever size noodles you want. Today we're going to go for a tagliatelle, which is somewhere between the thickness of a pappardelle and a fettuccine. This is a perfect shape for Bolognese because it's going to hold a lot of that rich, meaty sauce. Apparently, serving Bolognese on spaghetti noodles is a bit of an abomination, but hey, no one's here to judge. Freshly made pasta always cooks better when you let it dry for about 20 to 30 minutes, so we're going to do that right on the cutting board. Meanwhile, it's pretty safe to say our Bolognese sauce is now done. So at this point, you want to check it for final seasoning, add a little more salt and pepper if you need it, and make sure it's the right consistency that you're happy with. I like a Bolognese that's a little on the looser side because it's a lot easier to toss with noodles. Alright, move over Bolognese, here comes a pot of water. Or apparently that's a pan of water. I'm going to add a generous amount of salt and let this come to a full boil before adding the noodles. And before you all attack me in the comments and tell me I should be using a larger pot of water, I am only making a single serving size, so it ends up being okay. As long as your noodles have a good amount of room to flow around freely, you should be good. You don't want to cook fresh pasta for more than 2 minutes, and always save a little bit of that pasta water behind, cause you'll see why in a sec. I think you have a pretty good idea. But right now I'm going to drain my noodles and return the same pan right back to the stove. An Italian restaurant would not make a fresh pot of Bolognese sauce every single day. They would make enough to last for a few nights of service, and this is exactly how they would serve it. You take a little bit of that sauce and add it to a pan. Now, normally this would probably be coming from the fridge, so you would have to loosen it with a little bit of that pasta water. But because we just made our sauce now, we don't need to do that. We're going to let this come to a boil, and then in go our cooked and drained noodles. According to the books, you don't add the sauce on top of the noodles. You add the noodles to the sauce. Add a little bit of pasta water if you need to loosen it up a little bit, and then just toss to heat and coat thoroughly. You also don't want an overpowering amount of sauce. And there we have it, an actual authentic Bolognese. So many rules involved. But I think the one you're going to hate the most is the fact that customarily you're not supposed to add cheese to this. And that's okay, because as much as I do love cheese, I'm willing to skip out this time for the sake of authenticity. Make sure you get every little bit of that good sauce, and wow, look at how amazing that looks. If you make this, you're not going to be disappointed. My only regret was I didn't at least triple the recipe to make the cooking time a little more worth it. But that's okay. This was still totally worth it, and I even got a nice little video out of it. Just promise me one thing, that you won't make this on a hot day in July, especially if you don't have air conditioning.